What was your first encounter with psychedelics?
Sure, hearing about them or taking them?
Both.
I'll start with hearing about them. When I was in middle school, 7th or 8th grade, I forget, kids showed up on some Monday morning in science class, and there was inserted into the science curriculum what seemed to be almost an emergency response to what we learned was a drug problem. So for 2 weeks we learned about drugs. What is a drug? The teacher would say, is alcohol a drug? And kids, oh no, my dad takes that every day. It can't be a drug. Anyhow, we got straight on what is and isn't a drug, why you would call something a psychoactive drug. And the education, I think, was actually pretty good. This was long before Nancy Reagan and Just Say No. We learned about routes of administration, categories of drugs, stimulant, sedative, cannabinoid, hallucinogen. And we got the best available knowledge at the time about what is physical addiction, what is withdrawal, physical withdrawal symptoms, what is psychological addiction. And at the end of all of that, I made a mental note that what is the most interesting here would be the hallucinogens, and LSD in particular. Not physically addictive, not psychologically addictive, but it was clear they tried to describe the effects and couldn't fully do it. It wasn't because they wanted to withhold something, it was because it was mysterious and beyond what they could describe in a small number of words. So that was the mental note that I made. Someday I will try a psychedelic and probably LSD. And it wasn't until several years later, years out of college, that I finally did.
And can you talk about that experience?
I prefer not to talk about it very much. It feels quite personal. But I'll say something about the circumstances. I had fallen into a friend circle of pretty capable people studying psychology, a Buddhist studies major, and we decided to take various materials, mushrooms, LSD, together on a number of occasions, and kind of figured out through common sense, you might say, that it would be good for one person in the group, 4, 6, 7 people, to not take anything or only a very small amount. Some simple ground rules like nobody will leave the apartment. If somebody really doesn't like the music, it'll get changed. People can be physically affectionate but not sexual. And we began our explorations very informally. Speaking for myself, starting with low doses, a couple months later tried again, a slightly higher dose. And finally I hit a dose where, in a way I kind of expected, but you could never fully prepare for it. I had an experience that would now be called mystical type or non-dual, which was revelatory for me.
What do we call a mystical type of experience?
Let's start with the word mystical. It turns out that in the scientific study of religion, the term mystical, the mystical type experience, has a very narrow definition. And I'll return to what it is. But in the common understanding of the word mystical, it's anything that's a little unusual. Oh, somebody might say that they had a dream last night and their long departed Aunt Margaret came to them and gave them some very useful advice. Boy, that was a really mystical dream, they would say. In the scientific study of religion, it's a much narrower set of phenomena. And the key distinguishing characteristic is either a sense of the external all is one, that you and the camera and the lights and the room and the bacteria and the plants outside, the plant right over there, it's all the same thing, or deeply interconnected. And there's an even stronger form of this unitive consciousness, wherein not only is it interconnected, but I'm gone, and the old I, it's all one thing. It's a vast, unbounded, living presence, awareness, and aliveness that is completely unified. That's the strongest, narrowest sense of mystical experience. There's a sense of boundlessness. There can be differing senses of time and space, often but not always accompanied by a quite profound joy or sense of wonder. But it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody has telepathy or was visited by a spirit.
Does mystical experience relate to the person's religious beliefs, or is it completely unrelated to the beliefs?
The answer to that is probably complicated. There are religious traditions which, at the core of the tradition, the most common beliefs are that God or divinity is always separate from the individual, So the religious experience is to come into deeper relationship with that which is different from you, and you will never meet directly, you'll never merge with it. But you can get into more and more intimate relationship with it. And I believe that Judaism is an example of that. Buddhism would be a contrast example, where it is possible through extended meditation or spiritual practice to lose or let go of one sense of personal identity and merge into a universal field. And sometimes that field is perceived as being alive and intelligent. Other times it's just a vast, unbounded emptiness.
Can an atheist person have a mystical experience?
So there's a couple of answers to that. One is that a person who identifies as atheist can still experience a vast, unbounded awareness, but wouldn't label it anything like God or an intelligence. But the other answer is, and the literature on this is mixed, but there is now a scientific literature, survey literature, of people identifying as atheist and then having a strong non-dual experience, after which they no longer identify as atheist.
There is a kind of uncertainty with the terminology. Some people speak about hallucinogens or psychedelics or enteogens. How could you define what psychedelics are?
There's one answer if you're a neuroscientist, there's another answer if you're a chemist, there's another answer if you're an anthropologist, there's another answer if you're a linguist. Generally, the succession of terms in modern Western terms have been psychotomimetic. They mimic psychosis and might therefore have been thought many decades ago to be useful, especially for like a psychiatrist to take, to have a temporary internal experience of what it might be like to be psychotic. A couple hours later, you're not psychotic anymore, but now you understand your patients better. Then the term psychedelic, then the term entheogen. There are plenty of other terms, plant teachers, sacred medicines. They don't all mean the same thing. And I find myself switching back and forth depending on the audience and the exact meaning I'd like to convey.
Aldous Huxley was one of the key persons who introduced psychedelics to the Western culture. How do you see his legacy today?
Well, a brilliant thinker in many, many areas. He stands in a lineage where we could say it began with William James in his 1902 Varieties of Religious Experience, who treated mysticism in more or less the definition that the scientific study of religion would hold today. And Huxley believed in that particular framing, as did Walter Stace, a theologian, as has Ralph Hood, and now my colleagues at Hopkins. And I still think it's a very useful framework. However, people have pointed out that the narrow interpretation of mystical experience, if you only take that into account, you're leaving out lots of other kinds of experiences that may be adjacent, but have clinical relevance, personal relevance, and even spiritual relevance. For example, if you're visited by your long-departed aunt giving you certain advice about life, well, that may be a really important piece of life advice for you. It may be therapeutic for you, and it might be spiritual for you. And yet, if you were to take one of today's tests about mystical type experience, that wouldn't show up. So we probably do need a broader range of phenomena being recorded and talked about.
How do you define the religious use of psychedelics?
Well, let's start out by what we mean by the word religion. It turns out that the experts strongly disagree. Someplace in storage at home, I have an inch-thick manila folder filled with published papers about the definition of religion, and they're just all over the map. A safe place to begin is the derivation of the word. The Latin is religare, often defined as to bind back or to reconnect. I mentioned a minute ago Walter Houston Clark, who wrote a book 1959 called The Psychology of Religion. And in the front matter, he says, this book is going to talk about religion. And I want to share with you what I, Walter Houston Clark, have in mind when I use the word religion. It's not to make the other definitions wrong, but just so we can communicate. His definition of religion was the experience of somebody having a sense of the beyond, where beyond is capitalized, and in particular, when the person then makes an effort to harmonize their life with what's learned from the experience of the beyond. So it's quite experiential, followed by a behavioral component. And that to me is religion boiled down to nearly its essence, to which others would add, especially when it happens in a social context. Other people seeking, other people discovering, other people sharing so that we can jointly triangulate on what may be closer to the truth and what is further away from the truth or even delusional.
You made a significant contribution to the Johns Hopkins study on mystical types of experiences on psilocybin. Can you describe your contribution and also can you talk about the study?
Well, the contribution of myself and a number of elders who gathered together under the title the Council on Spiritual Practices, long before Hopkins was in the picture, held a number of meetings, including a pivotal meeting at Esalen Institute, to discern what we could do to advance things we cared about, which consisted largely of finding a way to make mystical type experience more available to more people under reasonably safeguarded circumstances. The belief that that would, over a population average, be a very helpful thing for many people. So after talking long about how to do that, how to make mystical type experience more available to more people, we figured that the psychedelics, I'll use that word, or the entheogens, were underutilized, misunderstood, and a way to correct that would be to cast the light of science on them. So various connections were made. Roland and I were introduced. I flew to Baltimore to meet with Roland, and that began a collaboration. And over a course of a couple of years, a conversation about, well, could we actually get government permission to give psilocybin, that was the material of choice at the time, to healthy, normal volunteers, in contrast to a clinical treatment trial, where you take depressed people and try to treat their depression, or people with end-of-life anxiety and to improve their quality of life at end of life. We wanted to start with people who did not have a DSM diagnosis. And it took a little while to figure out that the IRB might actually approve such a thing, that the FDA might approve such a thing, and that it would be feasible. So my role was really to make the connection to an excellent researcher at an excellent institution willing to do this work at a time when it was quite potentially a career challenge.
In the 60s, for many people, psychedelics served as a gateway to Eastern spirituality. But as far as I know, for Roland Griffis, it was the other way. So he started to do meditation, and he was very skeptical about psychedelics first. Is that right?
That's my understanding. I remember our first meeting in the cafeteria at the campus where his lab was located. He's a very curious man, and he asked me quite a lot about my own experiences and what had me leave the high-tech world to devote time to this Council on Spiritual Practices. He told me about his own meditation experiences, and we found commonality between them, which he probably knew to begin with, but it was nice to have it shared in conversation with somebody sitting across the lunch table with you. So he approached it from a standpoint of having had profound experiences of his own, which he wasn't very comfortable talking about them, but it was clear that they were profound and valuable to him and had him continue in a disciplined practice of meditation. Whereas I'd had experiences less through meditation, and the profound memorable ones, the impactful ones, through the use of psychedelics. So that's where we met, and we kind of figured over time, after checking with colleagues, well, I'm a career psychopharmacologist, and I know how to conduct clinical studies. Here's an institution where they could be conducted, and we think we can do really good high-quality science in this area. So that led to the first study. It was very important to the Council on Spiritual Practices that the early studies in this modern era of psychedelic research not be confined to treating a diagnosed mental health condition.
Can you shortly explain us what were the findings of the Johns Hopkins study?
Sure. So the first study was published in 2006, and the key findings were, first of all, nobody was seriously harmed. That we could tell, that was self-reported, nobody was harmed at all. So we had measures sensitive to mood disorders, disturbed sleep, anything that would detract from quality of life, and those were absent. There were some transient episodes of minor headache, which is very common with psilocybin, but nothing that a day or two later you would say, oh, that was an experience that left me worse off than I was. So practically no negative findings. With that out of the way, again, among many measures taken, the most impressive thing to us was that about a third of the people ranked their psilocybin experience, or one of them, as among the most spiritually significant and personally meaningful of their entire lives. And an additional third ranked it as the single most spiritually significant, personally meaningful of their entire lives.
Some people say Professor Griffiths imposed his religious beliefs on the research participants. Would you comment on that?
Well, keep in mind, I was then and am now based in California, and Johns Hopkins is literally on the other coast, so I have no first-hand information about this. My thought on the matter is that it would be very difficult for every investigator, for every session facilitator to behave like a robot and to give a precisely standardized, evenly intoned, hello, I am your robotic guide. We hope that you have a good journey today. Would you like to put the eye shades on now, please? So if Roland has enthusiasm for the experiences and a genuine affection and caring about the volunteers, they're going to feel some of that. The key thing scientifically is, did he behave similarly with all the volunteers? In other words, people getting placebo got the same cheerful, encouraging Roland Griffiths as the people who got placebo. If that's the case, and I strongly imagine that it was, then it was valid scientifically. You could imagine an experiment where the psilocybin and placebo sessions are conducted in a plain white room with no art on the walls, certainly no religious music, and probably no music at all. And the facilitators are strongly constrained. We're not going to talk to you. If you need encouragement, with prior consent only, we might put a hand on your hand or hold your hand, but we can't interact with you anymore. And that too would be valid scientifically if every session were conducted in that same we'll say sterile way.
We talk a lot about how to make psychedelics part of the mainstream medical care, but how should we regulate the religious and spiritual use of psychedelics?
Well, I don't think anyone on the research team at Hopkins, and most research teams, would be expert in how to lead somebody on a lifelong course of spiritual practice. Some of us have had some instruction in meditation or other spiritual practices, but I'm not aware that anyone other than maybe Bill Richards, as an ordained minister, are actually fully qualified to write down a program of instruction or practice. So I would defer to other people. I sometimes think of the work at Hopkins and elsewhere not as instructing other people how to incorporate the materials into some kind of a disciplined practice, but putting useful, empirically validated information on the table that can be used by people who do have that expertise. So, for example, there's a very well-known meditation instructor on the other coast, Jack Kornfield, who's one of the few Buddhist Vipassana meditation teachers to have said something other than psychedelics and meditation don't mix. You can't mix psychedelics with a disciplined practice that comes straight from Buddhism. Instead, he actually said in writing several decades ago, there may come a time when psychedelics can be usefully brought into the practice of Buddhism, but it must be in a very carefully designed program that upholds the precepts of Buddhism and embeds the psychedelic experience in a larger program of training. So there will be people like Jack, or successors to Jack, who will figure that out.
Do you see any signs in America that psychedelics are abused for profit in the name of spirituality?
For profit, sure. There are plenty of retreat centers around the world, a few of them underground in the United States, but many more around the world that are not underground. I imagine them to be all across the spectrum, from people who've trained for a long time. They might have apprenticed for decades under a practitioner in their tradition. They don't charge a lot of money. They welcome people to come in. They take very good care of them. At the other end of the spectrum are people who train for a week or a month or a year, which is far less than would be required in traditional cultures to be a medicine carrier, a medicine giver. And these retreat centers can be quite profitable. And there are quite a few reports of people who are not very well taken care of, including some quite tragic ones of people who are physically harmed or sexually abused.
What can we do to mitigate those risks?
It's widely discussed. I don't think I have much to add to the conversation. People talk about online reviews, for example, to be able to rank order retreat centers. I guess I do have one thought that I would offer to somebody who's thinking to travel out of the country, which is if you possibly can, don't do it alone. Go with a friend. Use the buddy system.
As far as I know, you have initiated a public statement in which you call for open science in the psychedelic research field. Why do you think that is important?
Mm-hmm. Well, it may prove to not be important, because in fact there's a lot of not very open science taking place now, and quite a number of organizations, usually corporations, that are claiming intellectual property in a way that is really pretty new to the field. What motivated me and the people who helped to develop this statement on open science was a sense that for quite a number of decades, people, starting, for example, with Sasha and Ann Shulgin, developed new compounds, new techniques of using them, shared very freely and openly their research findings with no intention of owning those findings, in the same way that we have learned from many people earlier than us, from other cultures, from earlier pioneers decades ago in the psychedelics field. It's been very open, very sharing, very collaborative. And there were early signs that no, there might be some entities that will come into being that will try to claim what many of us would think to be commonly held property. And through quirks in the US patent law and the international patent law, sometimes you can actually do that. You can take a well-known substance, for example, and say, actually, we own it for this purpose, or we own it when it's formulated in this exact way. And opinions vary. It's very expensive to develop a drug in the United States and to get FDA approval. And it might be the case that the only way to get that amount of money is by claiming you can keep other people away from the material and then have venture backers come in to invest in the product. I did not believe that was the only way, but we'll never really know.
One of the key challenges is that psychedelic treatment is very expensive. Do you think we can make it affordable for less advantaged people?
There's two ways to approach affordability. One is through government or philanthropic support at the individual level. If there's somebody who needs a $10,000 treatment, you find government money or private money who will find the $10,000 to afford that treatment. The other approach is to find treatments that are simply less expensive to begin with. My current sense is that there are, unfortunately, quite a number of people who are very seriously hurt and are suffering quite a lot with very complicated conditions. And they will actually need very skilled, specialized care that's, in fact, very expensive. But there's another group of people that are not the most needy people, the most complicated cases. They're much simpler cases. And we will probably find ways of treating them that take a lot less professional time per person.
How do you see the future of psychedelics? Will they find their way to the mainstream culture?
How will psychedelics find their way into mainstream culture? Well, I'm not sure that they will. And I imagine that there are less good ways that would happen and probably better ways in which that would happen. I think it's very important for this interval of time, when clinical studies are getting headlines in major publications, usually talking about the benefits and the breakthroughs and the amazing turnaround, and people who've been suffering for a long time in the course of a couple of days don't suffer so much anymore. That needs to be counterbalanced with very clear messaging that these are still experimental therapeutic interventions. They don't work for everyone, and some people will be harmed by them. It's like any other powerful intervention. Not every surgery goes as planned, and some surgeries end up doing more harm than good. So people need to approach this not with an idea that a psychedelic intervention is, quote, safe, but in consultation with a caregiver, a joint decision whether or not the risk, which may be a little larger or a little smaller, whether the risk is justified by the potential benefit. So we need the culture to understand that this is not a panacea, and especially when given in high doses, it is just not risk-free. So here's a thought that relates to the question about how psychedelics might move in better ways into the culture, and it has to do with the value of community. At a retreat center, people can come together who don't know each other. They're there for the 5 days of a retreat, then they fly to various places again and may or may not stay in touch. But that isn't how indigenous cultures use psychedelics. It often is not how they were used in the 1960s. It's often not how they're used now. It's used by people who are friends, you might say friend circles. It's used by communities of people who come together periodically, and not necessarily with a religious frame, although sometimes with a religious frame. And there's a lot to be said for the tempering quality of having powerful experiences held by a community of people, preferably age diverse, including elders, and with some stability to it. A community maybe where some people leave and some people come into it, but there's a stable core. And the general agreement in a community like that would be, we help each other, and in particular, we give each other permission to give feedback that might be uncomfortable to give and uncomfortable to receive, but we're all better off if we do that with each other in a loving way with an intention to help.